Thank you very much, Erica. Sorry, I'm still getting myself equipped. Thank you for inviting me to speak to everyone. Can everyone sort of see me? I'm exceptionally short, so the computers are sort of like, you don't need to see my face, but it might make it more pleasant. Oh, or not so for you. So I'll talk for probably about half an hour or so, and then hopefully open up a bit of a discussion from people. And I hope I've pitched this okay. We're going to get in the weeds of Burmese history a little bit, but I'm assuming a baseline knowledge of deep understanding of the country that everyone shares. So I'm sure you'll all be fine. So animal studies as an interdisciplinary field has been reckoning with the call to decolonize in recent years. This has been a small part of a much broader call that, in its current guise, first emerged from students challenging historically embedded power structures in the academy, particularly racism. It has taken many forms, but within animal studies, the most prominent part of this call has been to recognise the vitality and interpretive power of Indigenous communities' ways of being and understanding non-human creatures. As Zoe Todd has persuasively argued, post-humanist approaches to thinking about life in the Anthropocene often take concepts from Indigenous cosmologies, while in the process erasing this act of knowledge acquisition and failing to engage meaningfully with these communities. A decolonial approach, or as Todd puts it, an indigenizing approach, would put Indigenous practices at the center of analysis, resisting and expunging totalizing global narratives rooted in coloniality by situating knowledges in their precise localities. As with Todd's own work, the project of decolonizing animal studies has gained most momentum in the context of ongoing settler colonialism in North America and Australasia. Set against its antecedents, where decolonizing approaches perhaps go further than the still more ubiquitous efforts of post-colonial critique, is in its wider agenda to transform institutions of learning themselves. There is, to put it simply, a clearer line between scholarly practice and political praxis, although the decolonizing agenda is not beyond non-performative co-option by the very institutions most in need of decolonizing, with questionable commitment to meaningful change. In animal history, as a subfield of animal studies, the imperative to decolonize is only beginning to percolate through. Although studies embedded in histories of imperialism and increasingly colonized societies are now firmly established subjects. However, its parent discipline of history has had its own varied responses to decolonization. One powerful intervention has been the recent conversation piece published in the History Workshop Journal between Amanda Bain, Christina Freya, Emma Hunter, Elizabeth Leake, Sue Lynn Lewis, and Sarah Miller Davenport, all historians working in UK institutions. They draw attention to the divorcing of the agenda to decolonize histories from the historical study of decolonization itself. Here, referring to the material processes and lived experiences of the end of empire. This is a sharp and important insight, one that provokes reflection on the nascent decolonization of animal studies. There can be at times an ideational, even idealist tendency in some writings on the need to decolonize. I don't mean to be dismissive of this focus. Critical analysis is always sharpened by more rigorous conceptualization and a clear awareness of the philosophical stakes involved. Nevertheless, animal history, sitting as it does between the fields of animal studies and history, can be a bridge between the political and philosophical questions of the former and the reflexively empirical methodological bent of the latter. This brings to the fore a central question for animal historians, one that is yet to be systematically addressed. To what extent were animals themselves decolonized during decolonization? The history of decolonization in Myanmar makes for a useful case study. In its history, we can identify themes that may prove to be generative of answers to this question across different times and places. Myanmar's path to independence was chaotic and violent, resulting in some harder apparent breaks with the imperial regime than witnessed in other successor states of British colonies. Elephants, in particular, were caught up in the conflicts and contestations that marked the transitions from colony to nation state. I could say more about why elephants are important for a whole wide range of other species connected to them, but for now, I'm just going to talk about elephants. There were two major changes to their lives during decolonization. Firstly, the ownership of most of the colony's working elephants changed hands from European timber firms to the post-colonial state, although both struggled to secure possession of this vital animal capital. And secondly, the numbers of elephants who were conscripted into the timber industry fell significantly, in part due to the widespread disruption in the wake of the Japanese invasion of Myanmar, as well as the British reoccupation during the Second World War. At the same time, there were significant continuities. While diminished in number, timber work remained the primary form of employment for elephants in independent Myanmar, continuing modes of capture and captivity that expanded dramatically during British rule. The ecological transformation of Myanmar under imperialism persisted into the independence era and still shapes the country today, with all the deleterious effects on wild elephants' habitats. These aspects of the history offer valuable insights in and of themselves, but there are more generic themes apparent in the histories of elephants in Myanmar's decolonization. Two interconnected processes stand out as pertinent to bridging the calls to decolonize animal studies with those to decolonize history. These are the connected mid-20th century state-building projects of enforcing borders and building economic democracy. Neither were successful in Myanmar, but in their failures, they transformed the lives of elephants. So I'm going to talk about recolonizing and the colonization and recolonization of elephants to start with, just to give you something of a baseline. And what follows really is tightly focused on Myanmar and really in the weeds and the details. So please bear with me. And whilst you do, bear in mind that in what I'm doing here, the medium is kind of the message. Like getting into the details of what happens in decolonization prompts new research questions, and that's what I'm trying to show. The experience of British colonialism was transformative for Burmese elephants. The two major export industries that exploded during the late 19th century and through the early decades of the 20th, rice and teak, both had profounding and lasting consequences for these forest-dwelling giants. The second half of the 19th century was witness to a rice boom across the deltic regions to the south of Myanmar. You can see that sort of in the yellow in that map. What was a mangrove forested, sparsely populated, at least by humans, rural region during the Compound dynasty that ruled most of the south from 1752 to 1852 became an agricultural powerhouse of rice production. By the 1930s, Myanmar was the largest exporter of rice in the world. This dramatic expansion of wet rice paddy fields effectively decimated elephant habitats across huge swathes of the country, increasingly confining wild populations to forested upland regions. Those are the regions mostly in green and red and black, although there is a region in the middle of Myanmar which is also upland and forested. Here, they were enlisted into the timber industry in growing numbers. During the late 19th century, the timber industry, and particularly the export of teak, a hardwood that was in great demand across the British Empire for a manufacture of a range of commodities, from luxury furniture to railway sleepers, underwent two significant shifts. The first of these was the rapid expansion of the industry, measured both in terms of its share of the global market and in the area of Myanmar's forest used for the cultivation and harvesting of teak. The second was the concentration of the industry in the hands of a small number of British-financed and managed timber firms. Both of these shifts were dependent upon the capture and conscription of large numbers of Asian elephants. These elephants were mostly enlisted from the borders of the colony. In particular, British firms recruited from ethnic Karen majority areas to the east of the colony, where, through a patchwork of indigenous systems of governance, it bordered Thailand. So this map, you can't see the details particularly well, shows the forms of government that was in place in Myanmar. So you have strongly governed bureaucratic areas in yellow. You have loosely governed areas in green. You have you have red areas where it's even more loose and less structured, and the black areas where it was just unadministered, basically. The borderland area, which I'm going to be talking about mostly, is in red and green on the right-hand side of the map, where you have large numbers of Karen populations living there. It's not also important for the capturing of elephants, but also for the care of elephants. How they're managed is reliant upon those Karen modes of looking after elephants. And I could talk about those more if people are interested in them. So elephants enabled the exploitation of harder to reach teak forests, as no mechanical technologies could compete with the dexterity and strength of these powerful, intelligent creatures in navigating the challenging terrain of Burmese forests. The competitive edge that elephants provided to timber traders meant that British firms able to raise substantial amounts of capital, which were necessary to purchase large herds of working elephants, gained an unassailable advantage over Burmese outfits. By 1914, the size of the herd belonging to the largest and most dominant firm, the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, who I'm going to talk about a lot, so try and keep that name in your head. Their herd was, in 1914, 1,718 elephants, and they purchased over 500 more captive elephants during the interwar years. Prior to 1942, when the Japanese Imperial Army forced the British into a retreat, an estimated 7,000 elephants were working across the industry, the majority being employed by just 5 British firms. And that's discounting the number of calves which were held by these firms, which would take that figure up to maybe 10,000. The lives of these working elephants were commonly described as semi-captive, mostly due to the practice of releasing them at night to wander the forest, albeit hobbled by fetters and made audible by bells attached around their necks. The reliance on elephants also placed some constraints on the industry. Elephants required decent, accessible fodder and sources of fresh water to wash and drink. So you couldn't place your elephant camp anywhere. The regime for training them was violent, moderated by the need to preserve the physical and psychological integrity of any individual elephant. The aim was to build resilient relationships of trust between the elephant driver and the Burmese, mostly Karen, Uzi. The elephant driver is often called Uzi. Sorry, the elephant and the Burmese Uzi. We might consider the process of training as the forging of an intersubjective connection between subordinated Burmese, mostly Karen, wage laborers, and captive, but not fully domesticated, elephants. The lack of full subordination of both colonized workers and elephants to the authority of British capital, represented in the mostly white management of dominant timber firms, was manifest in a perpetual problem that confronted the industry: the disappearance, theft, and smuggling of elephants. Throughout imperial rule, the shifting borders of British Burma were sites of overlapping and unclear jurisdictions where firms struggled to enforce their claims to possession over elephants, who were stolen by others or sometimes escaped. Nevertheless, given the numbers involved in the timber industry by the 1940s, it is very likely that it was during the colonial period that the total population of elephants shifted firmly in balance towards the majority being captive at the expense of wild populations. This shift was then entrenched by and reinforced by the reproduction of the elephant workforce through regular capture from wild herds, as captive-born calves never met the shortfalls and were ultimately found to be an unprofitable way of replenishing labour requirements. This is compounded by the rigorous labour regime having an effect in undermining elephant fertility. This, then, is the baseline from which we might appraise the scope and extent to which elephants were decolonized. In many ways, the cracks in this status quo were already appearing in the 1930s. Labour strikes at timber firms, sawmills and docks brought frequent stoppages. The Saha peasant rebellion that engulfed the colony between 1930 and 1932 exposed the timber firms to the limitations of the protection that could be provided by the colonial state and revealed their need to form their own elephant-backed armed levies through their connections with Karen communities. The growth of anti-colonial nationalism pushed the firms into recruiting more Burmese staff into the higher echelons of their management structures, as well as attempts to cultivate ties with nationalist politicians. But this was a piecemeal and ineffectual strategy for staving off nationalist ire at their favourable position. These fissures in the edifice of the imperial order were exposed and became open fractures during the Second World War. The ignominious collapse of British authority in Southeast Asia during the war has been well documented. The human tragedy of the forced displacement of particularly Indian, Anglo-Indian and white communities in fear of the advancing Japanese troops is infamous for the callous racial logic behind the prioritization of retreat and relief efforts. The heroics of working elephants in carrying refugees over the punishing mountainous terrain to the relative safety of British India is justly well known and has been immortalized in a range of media, including a recent award-winning children's book. Don't buy it though, it's pretty grim. But the fate of working elephants that remained in Myanmar is less well documented. Even in the years that followed after the British reoccupation of Myanmar in 1944, it was not clear precisely what had happened to them. Save for those few elephants engaged in the arduous retreat to India, or who were conscripted into the British Army, the large timber firms left their essential animals, the most valuable assets that they owned, in the care of their uzis until they returned. Of the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation's 1,972 working elephants before the retreat, around 900 remained in the cares of their uzis at reoccupation. A further 200 had been identified as being owned in the regions of Thailand that bordered British Burma, so that's the region which runs along the right-hand side of the map. And it was optimistically hoped by the corporation that these could be recovered. There were two likely outcomes for the remaining 800 elephants. Some would have perished in the brutal fighting and exhaustive total war effort on this front line between two collapsing empires. Certainly, the Japanese military attempted to mobilize elephant power for themselves, although it would appear that they did so with very little success. Other elephants, with more luck, would have been able to use the opportunity of chaos in the realm of human affairs to liberate themselves and return to the forests, although the traumas of captivity may have made this itself a perilous transition. The impact of this loss of elephants was devastating to the rate of timber extraction in the industry, which by 1946, 2 years after reoccupation, was half of what it had been prior to the onset of hostilities in the colony. This was in spite of what was called the Wait Plan. put in place by the returning British government to rehabilitate the timber industry. This arrangement was indicative of the hubristic belief held by some in colonial officialdom that a semblance of the old colonial order could be reconstructed post-war. The plan saw the state take on responsibility for providing capital to firms, as well as shouldering the risk of unprofitable sales, while extending the leases of Myanmar's forests to the 5 largest timber firms, who had enjoyed those privileges before Japanese rule. The inability, though, of firms to recover their working herds meant that this plan had limited success. Nevertheless, there were 2 innovations that were to later provide the basis for the partial nationalization of the industry. First, the establishment of a state-managed timber board that worked closely with commercial firms, indeed was a major investor and stakeholder in the industry. The second was the formalization of the close relationship between the 5 British firms into a consortium. Previously, they'd operated in monopolistic ways, basically, as a group. The plan was envisaged as an ad hoc interim one that would hold until the colonial government was in place to resume working with the firms on the basis of long-term leases. However, it quickly became apparent that this was a transitory arrangement was just a step towards decolonization, basically. The Wait plan was unsurprisingly pilloried in the Burmese nationalist press as a resumption of the exploitative, extractive imperialism that drained wealth from the country into the pockets of British capitalists. The newly formed consortium lobbied Westminster and Whitehall to renew their lapsing longer-term leases to enable them to better fight nationalisation of the industry that their intelligence on Burmese politics told them was imminent. As independence went from being a political likelihood to a rapidly approaching inevitability, their correspondence with London became more clamorous and, frankly, desperate. There was, however, little that colonial authorities were able to do. On the ground, things had irrevocably changed, and decolonisation was already underway. Colonial plans for rehabilitating the timber industry along the lines that it had been run prior to the Second World War failed to factor in the situation on the ground. The countryside was under British rule in name only. The nationalist forces, who had turned on the Japanese and supported the British reoccupation in 1944, were effectively a shadow bureaucracy at local level in many parts of the country. In other parts, territory was in the control of communist fighters who, in 1946, had broken away from the largest and most popular nationalist force, the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, what I'm going to call the AFPFL, even though it's only marginally easier to get out of my mouth. This was headed by the charismatic Aung San. Some people might know him as the father of Aung San Suu Kyi. Political power was not in the process of a managed transfer, but was being seized from the colonial state from below, ahead of any formal agreements. In combination with the everyday problems that the timber firms faced, re-establishing their labor processes in this context, the recovery of their working elephants from Thailand was a drawn-out and diplomatically fraught endeavour. The borders were restive and Thai authorities were uncooperative. At the same time, new legislation was being passed restricting and regulating the movement between Myanmar and Thailand, including laws seeking to control the trade in wildlife. Concurrent to these changes, Karen nationalists, so again, if you're thinking about that eastern border, launched a rebellion that brought timber operations to a standstill in some parts of Myanmar, forcing the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation to abandon some of its forests with their elephants in 1947. One productive way of framing these transformations is to consider them as part of the anti-colonial nationalists' counter-hegemonic project. I'm going to explain that. That is, as parts of the attempt to build a state that both inherited the coercive power of the imperial predecessor, but that also redressed the injustices of the colonial order. This means, taking this counter-hegemonic project seriously, means firstly conceiving of the threats posed to the consortium of British firms by communist rebels, the AFPFL, both in high politics and their militias on the ground, and even the threats posed by their own workers as aspects of an attempt to realize greater economic democracy in Myanmar. And secondly, to situate timber firms' troubled experiences on Myanmar's eastern border as symptomatics of battles over the geobody of the successor state. These are really what's at stake in decolonization as it pertains to elephants. Beginning with the attempts to realize greater economic democracy, British timber firms were completely unprepared to react to the strength of popular opinion against them. Their strategies of writing pieces in the Burmese press and promoting some Burman people into their management structures and then lobbying colonial authorities were woefully insufficient in dealing with the threat that was posed to them, partly because they just didn't grapple with the problem of economic democracy. Even getting the elephants that they had been able to recover following the reoccupation back to work proved difficult due to a breakdown in labour relations at some of their key forest camps. They faced a reluctance among Karen foresters to take up contracts with them. And more concerningly, at least from the perspective of the firm's managers, strikes broke out among forest workers in 1947. Workers in elephant camps were not prone to striking. And I can talk about that a little bit in terms of if you're striking and the elephant is owned by the company, you're basically relinquishing your responsibility of care over those elephants, which puts a real burden on you as a striker, as your elephant is no longer being effectively looked after. But anyway, so as a result, they very rarely strike. And when they did take action in the past, notably in the 1920s, this was in the form of isolated wildcat action rather than through an informal union structure. In the summer of 1947, though, the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation faced a near stoppage of their forest operations on the Shuili River in the Shan region. So that's the big blue area on the right-hand side. While managers sought to play down the depth of feeling behind the action, blaming it on some, malcontents, a document which listed the demands of the strikers emphasized pay. More specifically, they demanded to be paid for their years looking after the elephants during Japanese occupation. That's 3 years of work looking after the elephants during which they received no pay. The corporation was sufficiently concerned about the unrest to sanction the withdrawal of all its white supervisory staff, and the strike was only broken after one of its leaders were murdered. Something which documents imply the shady hand of the consortiums themselves. Ultimately, the consortium did offer rewards to the workers for their time looking after the elephants during Japanese rule, although those amounts fell well short of what the strikers' demands were. The growing power of labour in Myanmar as British rule entered its final months was compounded in the eyes of the consortium by the disruption caused by communist rebellions. In the spring of 1947, dozens of Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation's elephants were seized by rebels in central Myanmar, along with hundreds of small arms. In one instance, in a forest camp, they found themselves ambushed by uniformed troops who identified themselves as communists who were battling AFPLF rule. The corporation's records describe the rebels as polite. Which amuses me endlessly. The concerted fighting was not directed against the timber firms and its agents. The rebels had been engaged in encounters with the military, the police, and militias loyal to Aung San. We might instead see the raids on the corporation's operations as framing the timber firms as holding assets, including elephants, that were fair game for expropriation in the fight to realize a social revolution in Myanmar. This might be why the leader of this particular raid was apparently apologetic about the disruption. The timber firms were no longer viewed as a powerful obstacle to decolonization. The writing was on the wall for the consortium, and that was legible to communist rebels from the vantage point of Myanmar's mountainous forests, even if the firms themselves were slow to read it. It is against the threat of communist insurrection and the seizure of their power, of their elephant power, that the policies of the AFPF, I will get this right once, the AFPLF towards nationalization should be understood. In the speeches of these leaders, they made it clear that some sort of nationalization was coming. And in 1948, when the country becomes independent, over a 6-month period, the consortium's operations were appropriated by the newly established independent regime. The desire of smaller Burmese timber firms, many of whom started off as elephant capturing firms, which is an interesting dynamic, their desire to inherit the favorable leases that these consortiums held was not realized. The newly established State Timber Board, an inheritor of that late colonial structure, became the owner of the firm's fixed capital, including, importantly, most importantly, their elephants. They also took over their stock in trade as well as forest rights. Now, the partial nationalization of the timber industry meant the state ownership of the vast majority of working elephants. And today, around 3,000 to 5,000 working elephants are still state-owned creatures in Myanmar, with a whole healthcare structure around them. It's a unique situation in many ways. Working elephants went from being private capital to being a national asset, but they were still tethered to the production of export commodities. One important exception to this near-state monopoly in working elephants was the Karen homeland, nascently established, of Kwathuli. So that's this red area, and down the yellow area that borders Thailand down there, where autonomy won in the early years of a civil war that broke out at independence, enabled Karen nationalists to exploit their timber through the mobilization of local elephants that historically they had been tasked with looking after and capturing. Logging, thus, became central to the political ecology and economics of post-colonial warfare in Myanmar. Now, this is the longest civil war ongoing civil war in history, or contemporary history. And elephants were central and conscripted into these endemic struggles. But whether now owned by the State Timber Board or by Karen nationalists, the material conditions of their lives remained, for the most part, the same as during the colonial period, semi-captive and bound to the labour processes of teak extraction. At the same time that the consortium found itself struggling to kickstart operations in the generous leases over the forests in Myanmar, it was embroiled in protracted difficulty to reclaim working elephants that had smuggled into Thailand, something which I've talked about before. The firms sent their agents to identify elephants that may have originally been in their herds, something they were able to do by the practice of branding elephants on their hides with the corporation logos, or through the descriptive roles they held on individual elephants that enabled them to identify them through their particular physical specificities. However, regardless of the strength of evidence that they could muster, it was apparent that they could not forcibly recover these elephants, even when the law was on their side. The firms opted instead to buy back the elephants at competitive rates. But even this seems to have had limited success. It is worth noting, though, that the timber firms were playing both sides of the law in this case. In the years immediately prior to the war, the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation had used the patchwork of jurisdictions, these loosely governed areas, to enable them to move elephants through Thailand or from Thailand without falling foul of game laws. There's all sorts of interesting stuff that happens here. Certain Shan rulers start giving out elephant passports, for instance, in this time, that enable them to sort of say, no, these are Shan elephants, and where the boundaries of those things lie. The questions about enable this illicit activity. In the early 1950s, they were again trying to find creative ways of circumventing legislation in Burma and Thailand to realize an ill-fated scheme to transfer some Burmese trained elephants to North Borneo to commence elephant capturing operations in that colony. So theoretically, all of their elephants should now be owned by the state, but they managed to keep a small number of them away from the state. And the plan was, as it emerged in 1949, to transfer them all the way to Borneo and obtain a license for elephant capturing there. But this happened at the very same time that the Thai government introduced a ban in the movement of wildlife, fearing the disappearance of their own biodiversity. So this scheme entailed some tricky diplomatic maneuvering, where they had to backtrack from their claims following the war that the elephants in Thailand were theirs, which was now a legal case being brought forward by the government of Burma, who claimed that those were their elephants now, and instead try to lobby the Thai government to give them special permission to move these few Burmese elephants and their Karen riders across the country to a port to go out to Borneo. It's unclear whether they were successful in getting that permission, but they did it anyway. And in 1951, 10 elephants arrived in Borneo, but the scheme was an unmitigated failure. As early as December 1952, 2 elephants had died. A year later, only 6 remained, and the corporation was giving up its plan to capture elephants and was now struggling to sell them. They contemplated having to shoot them if they could not find buyers. The ultimate fate of these elephants is not recorded, at least in the documents that I've consulted, but it was likely an unhappy end. The corporation's audacious plan to transplant its activities to a location where British colonial power was still ascendant ended in catastrophe for the last Burmese elephants to live under an imperial regime. You'll be glad to know I'm concluding now, and lunch is more imminent. In 1936, George Orwell wrote a powerful essay about his time as an imperial police officer in the Burmese port town of Molimine, where he felt forced to shoot an elephant that had rampaged through the streets, causing destruction in a fit of must. In his essay called Shooting an Elephant, Orwell tried to outline the psychological impact of being a tyrant. He did not want to kill the animal, but felt forced to do so by the audience of Burmese folk in front of whom he could not become a laughingstock. He was transformed in his performance of imperial authority. 11 years after the publication of this story, another large tusker called Phu Thai threw his rider and bolted through the streets of Kyungon village, about 200 miles north of Molimine. His killing was captured in a letter in the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation archive titled Shooting of an Elephant. Phu Thai had also caused damage to property and crops before being shot, but not this time by British police, who theoretically were still in control, but by members of a nationalist militia loyal to Aung San. They had been sent to the village to suppress crime, a new shadow police force forged in the heat of total war and anti-colonial fervour. The 2 episodes capture the nature of decolonization for elephants, crudely, perhaps, and in extremis, certainly, but they get to the heart of the problem. The change for elephants was mostly in the humans who controlled and killed them. But there is more to the story of decolonization in Myanmar as it affected elephants than the continuation of human supremacist ideologies and practices. the study or studying the history of animals and being sensitive to the imperative to protect some of the world's most endangered species requires historians to navigate difficult political terrain. And I think this is where some of the decolonial animal studies actually abdicates engagement with these difficult political questions. The ways that elephants were enrolled into the nationalist projects of greater economic democracy and post-colonial struggles over the political geobody of the successor state or states provokes some bigger questions for decolonizing agendas. How can we marry demands for economic justice with the protection of wildlife, or more radically still, rewilding? How can the trade in wildlife be combated without reinforcing the violence of post-colonial borders? There are no easy answers here, but the close study of the history of decolonization can, I hope to have shown through a lot of perhaps unnecessary, but I hope interesting detail, that can refine the project of decolonizing animal studies, generating productive contemporary problematics from the material and ideological struggles of the past. That's me.
Time for questions, so can I throw this at somebody?